Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we explore a story that began in a quiet, rural corner of the United States during the early 1970s. It is a story that would later become one of the most widely discussed haunting cases in modern American history, long before it was adapted into a popular film. The events described by one family unfolded slowly inside an old farmhouse, surrounded by fields and forests. The story centers on the Perron family and the house they moved into in the small village of Harrisville, Rhode Island. At first, the property appeared peaceful and welcoming, much like many historic homes scattered throughout rural New England. The building itself had stood for generations, quietly witnessing the lives of the families who had lived there before. When the Perron family arrived, they were simply searching for a place where they could settle and begin a new chapter of their lives. The farmhouse offered space, privacy, and the charm that often accompanies older homes. Yet, not long after moving in, the family began noticing small disturbances that seemed unusual but not immediately alarming. Over time, those small events gradually became more difficult to ignore. Objects appeared to move without explanation, strange sounds echoed through the rooms, and members of the family began to feel that the house itself carried a presence that could not easily be understood. What began as minor curiosity slowly developed into experiences that left the family searching for answers. Eventually, the story of the Perron family reached the attention of well-known paranormal investigators Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren. Their involvement brought wider attention to the case, and years later, the story would inspire one of the most famous supernatural films in modern cinema. Tonight, we will explore the history of the farmhouse, the experiences described by the Perron family, the investigations that followed, and the many explanations that have been proposed. As with many stories involving unexplained events, the truth remains a subject of debate and reflection. For now, allow the noise of the day to fade away and settle comfortably as the story begins. We will start by looking more closely at the farmhouse itself and the quiet Rhode Island countryside, where this unusual story first began. The story of the Perron family haunting begins in the quiet countryside of Harrisville, Rhode Island. The area is part of a rural landscape typical of New England, where winding roads pass through forests, small farms, and scattered historic homes that have stood for generations. Compared with busy cities nearby, Harrisville has long been known for its calm atmosphere and slower pace of life. During the early 1970s, the village retained much of its historic character. Many of the homes in the region had been built during the 18th or 19th centuries. These buildings often carried long histories, sometimes passing through many different families over the decades. Old wooden farmhouses, barns, and stone walls were common sights throughout the countryside. Among these historic structures stood the farmhouse that would later become associated with the Perron family's experiences. The house was large, weathered by time, and surrounded by open land. Like many old New England farmhouses, it had multiple rooms, narrow stairways, and thick wooden beams that had supported the structure for generations. Homes at this age often carry a strong sense of history. Over the decades, they witnessed the lives of many different families, each leaving behind traces of everyday life within the walls. Stories connected to older homes sometimes grow through local memory and folklore, especially in rural communities where history is deeply rooted in the landscape. The farmhouse in Harrisville had existed for well over a century before the Perron family ever saw it. During that time, it had served as a working farm residence, housing families who lived from the surrounding land. The property itself included fields and wooded areas that gave the house a quiet and somewhat isolated setting. To someone visiting the property for the first time, the farmhouse might appear peaceful and inviting. The surrounding countryside created a sense of privacy, far removed from busy urban environments. It was exactly the type of place where a family might imagine building a calm and comfortable life. Yet older houses sometimes come with mysteries tied to their long pasts. Records of previous owners, local stories, and historical events connected to the land can gradually shape how people view a place. At the time the Perron family first encountered the farmhouse, they were not yet aware of many of the stories that had become associated with the property over the years. For them, it was simply an old house in a quiet part of Rhode Island. But as time passed, the farmhouse would become the center of a story that drew attention from investigators, journalists, and eventually audiences around the world. In the early 1970s, the farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island became the new home of the Perron family. Roger and Carolyn Perron were raising 5 daughters, and they were searching for a place where their growing family could live comfortably. The large farmhouse offered space, open land, and the quiet environment that many families hope to find when moving to the countryside. When the family first arrived at the property, the house appeared full of character. Old farmhouses often carry a sense of charm created by their age and history. The wooden structure, the wide rooms, and the surrounding fields gave the home a feeling of tradition that is common throughout rural New England. To the Perron family, the property represented the beginning of a new chapter. The family moved into the house during the winter months of 1971. Settling into an unfamiliar home always takes time, especially when the building is older and larger than modern houses. Each family member began adjusting to the layout of the rooms, the creaking wooden floors, and the many small details that come with living in a historic farmhouse. Older houses often produce sounds that are unfamiliar to new residents. Wooden beams can shift slightly as temperatures change, floors may creak when someone walks across them, and pipes can produce knocking sounds within the walls. For families moving into historic homes, these details are often part of the adjustment period as they learn how the building behaves. During the early days after moving in, the Perron family experienced nothing that seemed especially unusual. The house felt like many other historic homes in the region, full of character and shaped by many decades of use. The quiet countryside surrounding the farmhouse added to the peaceful atmosphere. However, as the family continued settling into their new environment, small moments began to occur that caught their attention. At first, these events seemed minor and easy to overlook. A door might appear slightly open when no one remembered touching it, or a small object might seem out of place after being left somewhere else. Experiences like these are not uncommon when families move into older houses. Most of the time, they can be explained by simple misunderstandings or by the natural quirks of aging buildings. Yet for the Perron family, these small events would gradually become the beginning of a series of experiences that would shape how they came to understand their new home. As the Perron family settled into their farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the first unusual events began appearing quietly within the rhythms of everyday life. At first, these moments were subtle enough that they could easily be dismissed as normal occurrences in an older house. Historic buildings often carry small mysteries of their own, and the family initially assumed that the events they noticed were simply part of adjusting to a home built many decades earlier. One of the earliest disturbances involved small household objects being moved from their original positions. Carolyn Perron sometimes noticed that items she had placed carefully in the kitchen seemed to shift slightly when she returned to the room. A broom might be found leaning against a different wall, or a small object left on a table might later appear on the floor. These changes were minor and could easily be explained by simple forgetfulness or by the activities of family members moving through the house. At other times, the family reported hearing faint sounds echoing through the rooms. These noises were often described as soft footsteps or gentle knocking coming from distant parts of the house. Because the farmhouse was large and built with old wooden beams, such sounds were not immediately considered unusual. Houses of that age often produce creaks and echoes that travel through walls and ceilings. However, some of the disturbances began repeating in ways that seemed difficult to explain. Carolyn occasionally described hearing the sound of sweeping in the kitchen, even when no one else was present in the room. On a few occasions, she entered the space to find that objects appeared to have moved slightly, though no one had been there moments before. Another pattern involved doors that appeared to open slowly, without anyone touching them. In older homes, this can sometimes happen when air currents move through hallways, or when doors are not perfectly balanced on their hinges. Yet when these moments occurred repeatedly, they created a growing sense that something inside the house behaved differently than expected. The children in the family also noticed unusual details as they spent time exploring the property. Some of them described feeling that certain rooms in the house felt colder or quieter than others. At times, they reported hearing sounds late at night when the house should have been completely still. Despite these experiences, the Perron family did not immediately assume that anything supernatural was involved. Many of the events could still be interpreted as natural features of an old farmhouse. The family continued their daily routines while simply paying closer attention to the unusual moments that occasionally occurred around them. Yet, as weeks passed, the frequency of these small disturbances slowly increased. What had once been isolated events began appearing more regularly. The quiet farmhouse in rural Rhode Island was gradually becoming the setting for experiences that the family would soon find far more difficult to ignore. As the months passed in the farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the unusual events noticed by the Perron family began forming patterns that were harder to dismiss as simple coincidences. What had started as occasional sounds or small changes in the positions of objects slowly developed into disturbances that seemed to repeat in similar ways over time. One of the most noticeable patterns involved household items that appeared to move when no one was watching. Carolyn Perron later described returning to rooms where objects she had arranged carefully were no longer in the same place. Chairs might appear slightly out of position, small decorative items might be found on the floor, and objects in the kitchen sometimes seemed to shift between visits. At the same time, the sounds inside the house continued. Knocking noises were occasionally heard coming from the walls or floors. Sometimes in the evening hours when the family was gathered together. These sounds were not constant, but when they occurred, they often came without an obvious source. Because the house was old and large, echoes could travel in unusual ways through the structure. Another pattern involved doors and cupboards that appeared to open on their own. Some doors were reported to swing slowly while no one was nearby, and cupboards occasionally appeared open when the family was certain they had been closed earlier. These moments were often brief, but they contributed to a growing feeling that the house behaved unpredictably. Carolyn Perron also reported noticing unusual activity connected to cleaning tasks around the home. On several occasions, she described hearing the sound of sweeping on the kitchen floor, even when no one else was present. The sound was quiet but distinct, as though someone were moving a broom across the surface. When she entered the room to investigate, the space appeared empty and still. The children in the family also began discussing their experiences with one another. Some described hearing faint footsteps moving along the hallways at night, while others reported doors closing softly when the house was otherwise quiet. Because the farmhouse had many rooms and long corridors, it was sometimes difficult to determine where the sounds originated. Although these events remained mostly subtle, their repeated nature made them more difficult to ignore. The family began realizing that the disturbances were not isolated incidents. Instead, they appeared to occur regularly enough that the home itself seemed to have its own unpredictable rhythms. Despite this growing pattern, the Perron family still searched for ordinary explanations. Older houses often shift and settle over time, and air currents can sometimes cause doors to move or objects to fall. For a while, the family continued trying to interpret the events through practical possibilities. Yet, as the disturbances continued repeating in familiar ways, the sense of uncertainty inside the house slowly deepened. What had once seemed like the harmless quirks of an old farmhouse was beginning to feel like something far more unusual. As time passed in the farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the disturbances described by the Perron family began to move beyond sounds and shifting objects. According to the family's later accounts, some members began experiencing moments where they felt a strong sense that they were not alone in the house. These feelings were difficult to describe clearly, yet they became an important part of the story that the family shared. At first, these sensations were subtle. A family member might enter a room and suddenly feel as though someone was standing nearby, even though no one was visible. Such feelings can occur in many homes, particularly in older buildings where shadows, lighting, and quiet spaces sometimes create unusual impressions. However, the Perron family reported that these experiences began happening more frequently over time. Carolyn Perron later described moments when she believed she had briefly seen figures within the house. According to her accounts, these appearances were often quick and indistinct, sometimes resembling shadowy shapes that seemed to vanish when she tried to look more closely. The children in the family also described moments where they thought they saw figures moving through hallways or standing in distant rooms. These reports varied depending on which family member was speaking, and not every child described the same experiences. Some remembered feeling watched when they were alone in certain parts of the house, while others simply heard unusual sounds during the night. One of the aspects that unsettled the family most was the idea that these experiences sometimes seemed connected to specific areas of the house. Certain rooms reportedly felt different from others, creating a sense that some parts of the farmhouse carried a heavier atmosphere. These impressions were difficult to measure or verify, yet they influenced how the family moved through their own home. Over time, the parents began discussing whether the house might carry a long history connected to earlier residents. Because the farmhouse had existed for well over a century, many families had lived there before them. The possibility that the house might contain traces of its past became something the family started to consider more seriously. Stories connected to older homes often develop when people begin researching the history of a property. Records of previous owners, local legends, and events tied to the land sometimes create narratives that shape how residents interpret unusual experiences. In the Perron case, curiosity about the history of the farmhouse slowly grew. Whether these reported apparitions were caused by lighting, imagination, psychological stress, or something else entirely remains a subject of debate. What is clear is that these experiences deeply affected how the family understood the house they were living in. The quiet farmhouse that once seemed peaceful had gradually become a place filled with uncertainty and unanswered questions. As the unusual events inside the farmhouse continued, the Perron family gradually began searching for explanations that might help them understand what they believed they were experiencing. Living for long periods in a house where unexplained sounds, moving objects, and unsettling feelings occurred created a growing sense of uncertainty within the household. Naturally, the family began looking beyond their own observations to see whether the history of the property might provide clues. One of the first steps involved asking neighbors and longtime residents of Harrisville, Rhode Island, about the farmhouse and the land surrounding it. Rural communities often preserve memories of past residents, and families who have lived in an area for generations sometimes know stories connected to older properties. Through these conversations, the parents began learning that the farmhouse had passed through many owners over the centuries. Records suggested that the property had been home to numerous families dating back to the 18th century. Like many historic farmhouses in New England, the house had witnessed decades of everyday life, including births, illnesses, and deaths that were common during earlier periods of American history. Hearing these stories made the family increasingly curious about whether events from the past might somehow be connected to the experiences they were having. Carolyn Perron, in particular, began researching the history of the land more closely. She visited libraries and examined historical records, hoping to build a clearer picture of the families who had once lived on the property. As she gathered information, she discovered that several generations had occupied the farmhouse over the course of its long history. At the same time, the family continued discussing the events occurring inside the house with friends and relatives. Some visitors listened sympathetically, while others encouraged the family to consider practical explanations, such as structural issues or environmental factors. Houses built many decades earlier often develop unusual sounds and behaviors that can sometimes be mistaken for something more mysterious. The parents also considered whether emotional stress or the challenges of adjusting to a large historic home might have contributed to their experiences. Moving into a new environment can create unfamiliar sensations, and older buildings sometimes amplify small noises or shadows in ways that can feel unsettling until residents become accustomed to them. Despite exploring these possibilities, the family continued feeling that many of the disturbances remained difficult to explain. The repeated nature of the events and the number of experiences shared by different family members kept the mystery alive within the household. Eventually, the search for answers would lead the Perron family to contact individuals who specialized in investigating unusual phenomena. Paranormal researchers had begun gaining attention during the 1970s, and some families experiencing unexplained events turned to them for help. This decision would soon bring the farmhouse in Harrisville to the attention of investigators, whose involvement would transform the case into one of the most widely discussed haunting stories in modern American history. As the Perron family continued searching for answers to the disturbances they believed were occurring inside their farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, their story eventually reached the attention of individuals who specialized in investigating paranormal claims. During the 1970s, reports of alleged hauntings and poltergeist activity were attracting increasing interest across the United States, and some investigators had developed reputations for examining such cases. Among the most widely known figures in this field were Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens had already become recognized for their involvement in several high-profile investigations of alleged supernatural phenomena. Their work involved visiting locations where unusual events had been reported and speaking directly with the individuals experiencing them. When the Perron family's story reached them, the Warrens agreed to visit the farmhouse and meet with the family. Their goal was to hear first-hand accounts of the disturbances and to observe the environment in which the events were said to occur. Like many investigators who study paranormal claims, they began by asking detailed questions about the history of the property and the experiences described by those living in the house. During their visits, Ed and Lorraine Warren spoke extensively with Carolyn Perron and other members of the family. They listened carefully to descriptions of the strange sounds, moving objects, and reported apparitions that the parents believed they had encountered. The investigators also spent time observing the interior of the house, attempting to understand the layout and conditions of the property. According to later interviews, Lorraine Warren described sensing unusual energy within the home. She believed that the disturbances reported by the family might be connected to a hostile spiritual presence. These interpretations reflected the Warrens' approach to paranormal investigation, which often included the belief that certain disturbances could involve spirits connected to the history of a location. Their involvement significantly increased attention surrounding the case. Once the Warrens became connected with the Perron family, the story began spreading more widely among paranormal research groups and media outlets interested in unexplained phenomena. What had once been a private family experience inside a rural farmhouse was gradually becoming a story known far beyond the small community of Harrisville. At the same time, not everyone accepted the Warrens' conclusions. Skeptics and researchers who favored scientific explanations questioned whether the reported disturbances could be verified through objective evidence. They argued that cases involving unusual claims should be examined carefully before drawing conclusions about supernatural causes. Despite these debates, the arrival of Ed and Lorraine Warren marked an important turning point in the Perron haunting story. Their investigation brought national curiosity to the case and helped transform the quiet farmhouse into one of the most widely discussed locations in modern paranormal history. As the investigation into the Perron family's experiences continued, the situation inside the farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, reportedly became increasingly tense. The presence of paranormal investigators brought new attention to the disturbances the family believed they had been experiencing. For several years, during this period, the investigators considered different ways to understand what might be happening within the house. Among the steps taken during the investigation was the decision to hold a séance. In paranormal traditions, a séance is a gathering where participants attempt to communicate with spirits or entities believed to exist beyond the physical world. These sessions often involve quiet concentration, spoken questions, and the hope that responses might appear through subtle movements or sensations. According to accounts later shared by members of the Perron family, one such séance was conducted inside the farmhouse, while investigators and family members were present. The goal of the gathering was to determine whether the disturbances reported in the house might be connected to the presence of spirits tied to the property's long history. The atmosphere during the séance was described as quiet and focused. Participants gathered together and attempted to concentrate on communication with whatever presence might be connected to the house. Such gatherings often involve long periods of stillness, where participants listen carefully for any unusual sound or movement. During this session, Carolyn Perron reportedly experienced a moment that deeply unsettled those present. According to her later descriptions, she suddenly began speaking in a voice that those in the room felt sounded different from her normal speech. Some witnesses believed she appeared to enter a trance-like state, creating concern among the participants observing the event. Accounts from those present suggest that the moment was brief but intense. Members of the family later said they became frightened by what they believed was happening and chose to end the séance soon afterward. For them, the experience reinforced the feeling that the disturbances in the house might involve something beyond their understanding. Other observers have approached these reports with caution. Séances often involve heightened emotional states, and participants may interpret unusual reactions in different ways depending on their expectations or beliefs. Without clear recordings or documentation, it can be difficult to determine exactly what occurred during such gatherings. Regardless of interpretation, the séance became one of the most widely discussed moments in the Perron family's story. The experience contributed to the growing tension surrounding the case and strengthened the belief among some participants that the house contained forces connected to its long past. From that point forward, the atmosphere inside the farmhouse reportedly became more uneasy. The family continued living in the home, but the events that had once seemed mysterious were now intertwined with fear and uncertainty about what might still be present within the walls of the old house. As the story of the Perron family's experiences became more widely known, it naturally attracted attention from both believers and skeptics. Whenever a case involving alleged paranormal activity reaches a larger audience, researchers and investigators often examine the claims carefully in order to determine whether ordinary explanations might account for the events. The Perron case was no exception. Some investigators began reviewing the details surrounding the disturbances reported in the farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. Their goal was to examine the property itself and determine whether natural causes could explain the sounds, movements, and sensations described by the family. Older houses, particularly those built more than a century earlier, often produce unusual noises due to shifting wood, temperature changes, or plumbing systems within the walls. Structural explanations were among the first possibilities considered. Wooden beams can expand and contract with seasonal weather changes, creating knocking or creaking sounds that travel through the structure. Air currents moving through hallways and staircases can also cause doors to open slightly or objects to shift if they are not firmly positioned. Lighting conditions inside older homes can sometimes produce shadows that appear unusual, especially at night when interior lighting creates contrasts across hallways and rooms. Investigators who favored practical explanations suggested that some reported apparitions might have been caused by reflections, changing light sources, or simple misinterpretation of shapes within dim spaces. Psychological factors were also discussed. Living in an unfamiliar historic house can create a heightened awareness of small sounds or movements that might otherwise go unnoticed. When several members of a family begin sharing similar concerns, their perceptions of events can sometimes influence one another. Researchers studying unusual experiences often consider how stress, expectation, and shared storytelling can shape how people interpret what they see and hear. Some skeptics also pointed out that no clear physical evidence was ever documented that could conclusively demonstrate paranormal activity in the house. While many witnesses described unusual experiences, the events were often reported after they occurred rather than recorded directly. Without clear documentation, determining exactly what happened in specific moments becomes difficult. Supporters of the paranormal interpretation responded by noting the number of experiences described by the Perron family over many years. They argued that the consistency of the family's accounts suggested that the events had deeply affected those who lived in the house. This difference of opinion created an ongoing debate that continues even today. Some researchers view the Perron case as a genuine example of unexplained phenomena, while others see it as a complex mixture of perception, environmental factors, and the powerful influence of storytelling. The discussion between these perspectives became part of the story itself. The Perron haunting was no longer only about what may have happened inside the farmhouse. It had also become a case study in how people interpret mysterious experiences and how communities attempt to understand events that challenge ordinary explanations. As the years passed, the story of the Perron family's experiences gradually moved beyond the quiet countryside of Harrisville, Rhode Island, and began attracting wider attention. Accounts of the disturbances inside the farmhouse were discussed among paranormal researchers, journalists, and audiences interested in unusual historical cases. Over time, the story became one of the most widely recognized haunting narratives connected to modern American folklore. Much of this growing interest developed through books, interviews, and public discussions about alleged hauntings. The experiences described by the Perron family were shared in detail through personal accounts and later through written works that attempted to document the events. These publications introduced the story to readers who had never visited the farmhouse or heard about the case before. As the story spread, it also became connected to the work of investigators such as Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren. Their involvement brought additional attention to the case, as they were already known for investigating several other high-profile paranormal claims. Media discussions about their investigations often included references to the Perron family's experiences. Decades later, the story gained even greater recognition when it inspired the horror film The Conjuring. Although the film presented a dramatized version of the events, it introduced the case to a global audience. Viewers who watched the movie often became curious about the real history behind the story and began exploring the original accounts connected to the Perron family. The success of the film led to renewed interest in the farmhouse and its history. Documentaries, interviews, and articles revisited the case, examining both the experiences described by the family and the different interpretations offered by investigators and skeptics. The property itself became known as one of the most famous alleged haunted locations in the United States. This cultural attention also changed how the story was remembered. For some audiences, the Perron case became closely associated with the dramatic elements presented in the film. Others focused on the original accounts shared by the family and the investigators who visited the property. During the 1970s, the combination of personal testimony, investigative reports, and cinematic adaptation ensured that the story would continue to circulate long after the events themselves had taken place. The farmhouse that once stood quietly in rural Rhode Island had become a symbol of one of the most famous haunting stories in modern popular culture. Yet despite the widespread recognition the story achieved, the central mystery remained unresolved. The cultural impact of the case ensured that discussions about the Perron family's experiences would continue, inviting each new generation to consider the events and decide for themselves what might truly have occurred within the old farmhouse. As the years passed after the Perron family eventually left the farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the events described by the family gradually became part of a larger conversation about unexplained phenomena. What had once been a private experience inside a rural home slowly transformed into one of the most widely discussed haunting cases in modern American history. The Perron family later shared their story through interviews and written accounts describing the years they spent living in the farmhouse. Their descriptions of moving objects, strange sounds, and reported apparitions attracted attention from readers and researchers interested in paranormal cases. These personal narratives helped preserve the story long after the family had moved away from the property. Interest in the case also remained strong among paranormal investigators, because the farmhouse had a long recorded history and numerous witnesses connected to the story. It became an example frequently discussed when examining alleged hauntings in the United States. Researchers studying similar cases often compared the Perron experiences with other reports of poltergeist activity. At the same time, skeptics continued examining the story from a different perspective. Some investigators suggested that many of the reported disturbances could be explained through environmental factors, structural noises in an old house, or the influence of expectation and stress within a family environment. Without clear physical evidence recorded during the events, the case remained open to multiple interpretations. The farmhouse itself eventually returned to being an ordinary residence. New owners lived in the house in the years that followed, and daily life in the quiet countryside continued much as it always had. For residents of the area, the property was simply part of the landscape rather than the center of a mystery. Yet beyond the local community, the story continued, attracting attention through books, documentaries, and discussions about famous haunting cases. The later success of The Conjuring introduced the story to audiences around the world, ensuring that the Perron family's experiences would remain widely known. Today, the case occupies an unusual place between folklore and historical record. Some people view the Perron haunting as a genuine example of paranormal activity, while others believe the events can be explained through natural causes or psychological influences. Because no definitive answer has ever been established, the story continues to invite curiosity and debate. The legacy of the Perron family haunting lies not only in the events themselves, but also in the questions they raise. Stories like this remind us that history often preserves moments that resist simple explanation. Whether interpreted as a haunting or as a complex human experience shaped by environment and belief, the Perron case continues to fascinate those who encounter it. As tonight's story comes to a quiet close, the old farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island returns to the peaceful countryside where it has stood for generations. The fields surrounding the house remain still, and the rural roads nearby continue carrying the slow rhythm of everyday life. For many people living in the area today, the farmhouse is simply another historic building among the many scattered across the New England landscape. Yet for the Perron family, the years spent inside that home left memories that would follow them long after they moved away. The strange sounds, shifting objects, and moments of uncertainty described in their accounts created a story that captured the attention of investigators, journalists, and eventually audiences around the world. Stories like this often remain difficult to resolve completely. Some listeners view them as evidence that unexplained forces might occasionally appear within ordinary places. Others believe that natural causes, human perception, and the powerful influence of storytelling eventually explain most mysteries. In cases like the Perron haunting, both perspectives continue to exist side by side. What makes a story enduring is not only the events themselves, but the questions they leave behind. Old houses, especially those with long histories, often carry the weight of many lives lived within their walls. When unusual experiences occur in such places, they invite curiosity about the past and about how human memory and interpretation shape the stories we tell. Through books, interviews, and the later influence of films like The Conjuring, the Perron family's experiences became part of a much larger cultural conversation about hauntings and unexplained phenomena. The farmhouse that once stood quietly in rural Rhode Island became known around the world as the setting for one of the most famous haunting stories of the modern era. If you found tonight's calm documentary relaxing or interesting, you are always welcome here. Subscribing to the channel and leaving a like helps support the creation of more long-form stories designed for peaceful listening and quiet reflection at the end of the day. Now the story gently fades into the stillness of the night. There is nothing more to solve or analyze this evening. Let the quiet settle in. Allow your thoughts to slow down and drift comfortably into rest as the mind gradually relaxes into sleep.